Hello, and welcome to Apologetics 101, and I'm your host, Christian apologist Brian Keith Bowen, and also welcome to the Genesis controversy of the next episode of it. Um, Today, we are going to be working off the heels of the interview that I had on my last video with Dr. Jason Lisle. This one won't be with Dr. Jason Lisle, of course, but it's going to be working off the same kind of stuff that we talked about in that interview because we covered a lot of ground in that interview of the three articles that Joel had written against Lyle's critique of William Lane Craig's uh, position in his First Things article, which Anderson kept mistakenly think that he was critiquing Craig's book when he was actually critiquing his article. Um, in any given case, we're going to be working off the heels of that, but so I'm going to reference it a lot during the evaluation of the blog that was written by Joe Edmund Anderson in my response to him. And without further ado, let's dive in. Well, here we are again. If you didn't watch my last video, I had interviewed Dr. Jason Lau. That was that was pretty awesome. Um, and I would recommend you watching that video. And because this video is the third installment of my response to Joe Edmund Anderson, and it's going to be working a lot on the heels of that interview with Dr. Jason Lau. Now that I had a chance to actually talk with Dr. Jason Lau, I even understand his arguments even better. Um, of course, I understood his arguments a lot better than Joe Anderson did, who constantly strawmanned the positions of Dr. Jason Lau. But uh, but it was helpful to talk to him and we had a very interesting conversation. I mean, we talked about the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11. We talked about the genealogies in other places in scripture, specifically in Matthew and Luke as well. And the kinds of information there are indicative of historical narrative. Um, we talked about historical narrative versus poetic narrative. We went basically all over this issue, and it was a really good discussion, and I would recommend it. It was actually the fastest growing video I've ever had on this channel. In less than 24 hours, I had almost 65 views on that one video. Less than 24 hours. Now I've got videos on this channel that's about 200 views and so forth. The point is that usually that takes time to accumulate that many views, and it was just kind of blew me away that it actually took almost 65 views, but and in less than a day. So it was a very good. Right now, I think that the last time I checked, the number was like over 90 views, particular interview. And so here we are again doing the third response. I will be doing a Joel stops his responses at the third one. He said in part one of his book review of Craig's book, he said he was not going to continue his response to Dr. Jason Lau. And so I was going to end it here in the third part, but because he supplemented that with the book review and because of a series of arguments he makes uh, in the book review, four-part review, book review on this his blog site, I decided to go ahead and continue with this series and respond to his arguments in all four of those blog posts so that we can least try to end the series good, since he decided to not to finish the his critique of Dr. Lisle. And so we're going to jump right into that. And the third one, which is the last part that he made toward Dr. Jason Lisle's critique. And this is going to work a good deal off the heels of my interview with Dr. Jason Lisle, so I'm going to refer back to it quite a bit. But anyhow, he made this third installment. It's the last one he makes critiquing Dr. Jason Lisle. He does not finish his critique of Dr. Jason Lisle, and he said in part one he wasn't going to critique it. Dr. Jason Lisle says he's glad he was going to critique it because he didn't really he didn't represent his arguments correctly anyhow. All right, Anderson titles this The Way Jason Lisle Views Worldview and William Lane Craig, part 3. All right. He said last week, Jason Lisle puts out the third installment in which he offers his critique of William Lane Craig's new book, The Quest for the Historical Atom. Lisle's post is entitled The Historical Atom, a Worldview Based on Fact or Fiction. And the title alone is quite telling for us. Oh, you notice this part right here, The Quest for the Historical Atom. He constantly retitles it differently. It's actually, the book's title is actually, I got Craig's book here. Craig's book is actually In Quest of the Historical Atom. And so he can constantly get that book title wrong. Another thing he gets wrong is that he keeps on saying that Lisle is critiquing Craig's book, which is not true. He's critiquing Lisle's First Things article. In fact, Dr. Jason Lisle himself said that in our interview, and I've said it myself in part one of this response to Joe Edmund Anderson. He constantly gets that wrong. All right. And the title alone is quite telling for us, or for as I've noted in the earlier post on Lisle's critique, myth and fiction are two different genres of literature. Actually, myth is, as Dr. Jason Lisle pointed out, kind of like a subcategory of fiction. Fiction is a very broad genre that can include lots of other things. For example, this isn't Dr. Lisle's example, but this is my example. You could say a romance novel and a science fiction novel are two different genres. I mean, science fiction novels not going to be written in the same form, same style as a romance novel, but they're both classified under the description of fiction. So fiction is kind of a very broad category. Dr. Jason Lisle said, all myth is fiction, but not all fiction might be myth. So, it's like a subcategory of fiction. But you wouldn't argue any of the events in that are classified in myth literature, like the Battle of the Titans, for example, with the Greek gods. Would Joe ever say that event actually took place? No, he wouldn't. So by definition, it is fiction. All right. Two groups of genre of literature. This is more of a subcategory of fiction. The fact that Lisle continues to conflate the two and make that central point in his argument tells me at least that his comments are not serious. His comments are very serious. In fact, I didn't find Anderson's critique very seriously in terms of scholarly discussion. I think Lisle is right in his assessment. It's more of an emotional, knee-jerk reaction to his critique rather than a serious, thoughtful, scholarly critique or response. Craig's attempt to wrestle with the proper way to understand the interpret Genesis 1 to 11, except that's not the proper way to understand it. The proper way to understand it is as historical narrative. I've already discussed this in this series. I've already discussed this in my interview with Dr. Jason Lisle. We talked about the series of all consecutives, the use of irrelevant details, the use of generalities, the toledotes, the kinds of sources of information that it presents, the way in which it it has a smooth transition between chapters 11 and 12, with no hint at changing style. The way the New Testament writers refer back to the Genesis chapters 1 through 11 is literal history, and as the people within the narrative as literal persons, etc. So it has all the earmarks of historical narrative and none for myth literature, which he has not provided. And he won't provide any in there either. He doesn't give any examples or evidence that this myth literature. One will be able to tell based just on the quotations from William Lane Craig that Lisle provides that William Lane Craig's view can be pretty much summed up the following way. Genesis 1 through 11 does have all the literary hallmarks of ancient Near Eastern myth, but part of it really seems to give impression that it taking about something historical. How can we make sense of that? Now, just to be fair, Craig argues that the persons within the narrative is historical, but he does think the narrative is allegorical. At least that's what he said before. But other than that, it's a pretty close stillmanning of Craig's position. I disagree with it, definitely, but it is a stillmanning of his position. It does not have the hallmarks of ancient Near Eastern myth. That's false. It has every bit of the distinctions that we would expect from the literary style of historical narrative. I, for one, appreciate William Lane Craig's honest attempt to seriously consider and conclude to a degree that Genesis 1 to 11 has all hallmarks of ancient Near Eastern myth, because quite frankly, it does. No, it doesn't. Again, he provides no evidence for this. He just kind of asserts it. But let's talk about his honest attempt. Okay. I've got William Lane Craig's book here, In Quest of the Historical Adam. All right. Now, I would say that Craig is he does throw out things that I would say is honest submission. So I don't think that he's dishonest, but that sincerity is no gauge for truth in this. Someone could be really sincere about what they believe and be sincerely wrong. So sincerity is not the gauge for truth. It might be the gauge of whether someone's being deceptive or not, you know. I don't think Craig, but the question isn't, is Craig being deceptive? The question is Craig right or wrong? And he's wrong. He's completely wrong. But that is the, so I would say that he has certain things in here that I will say is an honest mission. For example, he admits that Genesis 1 through 11 is not poetic narrative. That's an honest admission, because I would expect that it will work better for his thesis if Genesis 1 through 11 is poetic narrative. Like I did with my interview with Dr. Jason Lisle, we talked about this. Most of the ancient Near Eastern myths are written in a poetic style, poetic narrative. But he admits that Genesis 1 through 11 is not poetic narrative. So that, I found that to be an honest admission. Now, with that said, is that the same thing in the context in which Anderson's meaning here, making an honest assessment, which he thinks the honest assessment would be to claim that it's the same as myth literature. It's not. But it wouldn't be an honest assessment in that sense, because William Lane Craig has admitted ahead of time that he had, even before he began his investigation, that he had certain types of inclinations regarding certain things that he couldn't reconcile in his mind regarding Genesis chapters 1 to 11, you know, the serpent talking, tree of knowledge of good and evil, breathing the breath of life in Adam, things like that. And so this shows that his argument initially was very presuppositional. He already assumed that, and he's been quite upfront and honest about that as well. But he arrived at the conclusion that he already believed to begin with before he started his investigation. So I wouldn't say it's an honest assessment, at least in the sense in which he means. Do I think Craig is lying about anything? No. but he is very wrong. And he starts off with the conclusion that there's something off with the narrative even before he begins his investigation. So I wouldn't exactly call it an honest assessment per se, at least not in the way in which he uses it. But it does not have the earmarks of ancient Near Eastern myth. And if it did, and if he really believes, Anderson here really believes that it does, then why doesn't he provide any examples? Give us some evidence. Give some examples where the style of literature is the same in Epic of Gilgamesh. Give us an example where the style of literature is the same in Enuma Elish. I have these on my computer. Let me bring them up real quick. All right, here we see Eridu Genesis. Says, let me bethink myself of my humankind, all forgotten as they are, and mindful of mine, Nihil's creatures, let me bring them back, and let them lead the people back from their trails. Let them lead their they come and build cities and cold places, and that I may cool myself in their shade. This does not at all look like the literary style of Genesis 1-11. Let's look at the others. Here's another one I have. It's called The Myth of Adapa. All right. Says he, talking about Adapa, possessed intelligence. His command, like the command of Anu. He, the god of, I think that's might pronounce you or I don't know how to pronounce it really. Granted him a wide ear to reveal the destiny of the land. He granted him wisdom, but he did not grant him eternal life in those days and those years. And the wise men of Eridu. Let's do another one. Here's another one. Epic of Trahasis. Let's see now. When the gods were man, they did forced labor. They bore drudgery. Great indeed was the drudgery of the god. They forced labor was heavy. The misery is too much. The seven great Anuna gods were burdened. The Ega gods with forced labor. Again, doesn't sound nothing like Genesis account as far as the literary styles go. This is Enuma Elish. I've already shown it once before. When the height of heaven was not named, and the earth beneath did not bear a name, and the primeval Apsu, who begat them, and Chaos Tiamat, the mother of them both, the waters were mingled together, and no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen. When of the gods none had been called into being, and none bore a name, and no destinies were ordained. This does not sound like nothing in Genesis in terms of style. All right. So yeah, that don't have as you see, the literary styles are very different. But he won't present any examples or evidence at all of the style being one and the same with Genesis 1-11. He goes further, he says, whether one ends up disagreeing with William Craig, coming to his conclusions, or agreeing with my view that we need to just accept Genesis 1-11's genre as ancient Near Eastern myth. In other words, just agree with me and get over with it. We can't agree without any basis for it. If all the evidence points to it being a historical narrative, then why should I argue for a position that can't be defended? And Anderson has yet to defend this. And that we need to be okay with the possibility, that's the appeal to possibility fallacy, that it isn't meant to be understood as literal history. The fact that it's possible that something can be read as literal history isn't the same as probable. It isn't the same as truth. Something could be very possible and yet not the case. It's the possible I could be dreaming this whole video thing, recording it, but that doesn't mean I am. The issue is not on whether it's possible or not, but whether it's true or not, whether it's possible or it's probable. The issue is whether Genesis 1-11 is myth literature or historical narrative. That's the issue, not whether it's possible. He wants you to accept the possibility so you can agree with him without any basis whatsoever for thinking it in the first place. That's not the way we assess literary genres. It's not take my position no matter what, even though I have no reason for thinking it. We have to have the reasons to justify it. So far, all the evidence points to it being historical narrative. He said, whatever one conclusion ends up being, I think it is safe to say that anyone who takes Genesis 1 to 11 seriously must take the time to wrestle with William Lane Craig's points. It's the responsible thing to do. We do wrestle with it, and we wrestle with even what Anderson says. But I don't think Anderson really seriously wrestles with what we say. I think he just kind of half-heartedly doesn't really deal with our responses. He doesn't even carefully making sure he has a tendency to straw man young earth creationists a lot. Dr. Jason Lisle, one of the complaints that Dr. Jason Lisle had of his Anderson's arguments is that he had a tendency to straw man them, and he does. I've got Anderson's book here, Heresy of Ham here, which he goes over like he attacks young earth creationists, but he's mostly attacking Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis. But the interesting part is he strawmans us a lot in the book. So he tries to come off like an expert in young earth creationists when he fails to really represent our arguments properly. As we shall see, though, it is quite obvious that Lisle has no interest in really doing that. With that, let's see what Lisle say. Actually, Lisle is very serious in doing that, and he does. But if all the basis of historical narrative or Genesis 1 through 11 as historical narrative is on that position, why should I take it as myth literature when there's no similarity in terms of style? Opening. Lisle begins his post by talking about the 4th of July without belaboring the point. Here's his point. Americans celebrate American Independence Day every 4th of July because that was the date in history that Declaration of Independence was signed. If it didn't really happen, instead someone said we were celebrating the events of the fictional movie Independence Day, then any celebration of the 4th of July would be meaningless. Therefore, Lisle concludes William Lane Craig's claim that Genesis 1 to 11 acted as Israel's founding myth is equally stupid and meaningless. He actually doesn't say stupid, because that would mean biblical worldview would be wrong since truth cannot be based on falsehood. All right. He says, not only is Lisle demonstrating the inability to distinguish between two different genres of literature, namely myth and fiction, we've already discussed that, but he also putting on full display his false assumption that truth can only mean historical fact. All right, this is a straw man argument. Nowhere, I've studied Dr. Jason Lisle. I've had him on this channel last time. I've got his books over here. And I've read quite a bit of what he wrote, both in articles and in books, and even some stuff that he's got peer reviewed. And I'm telling you right now, the Dr. Jason Lisle recognizes that there are other avenues of knowledge, such as scientific knowledge, as well as historical knowledge that we can gain. So this is a straw man argument, and fundamentally misrepresents his position. That's not what he was talking about. He's saying that okay, the way Anderson presents the argument, he doesn't actually think that anything that Genesis 1 through 11 says actually happened. And so he doesn't recognize it. When you're recognizing a past event, that's ultimately what you're recognizing, whether it's historically true or not. And that's how historians actually use it. Historians use it that way. If even if someone like Bart Ehrman would say, hey, that's not historical, he's saying they did not actually happen in history. He's not saying, hey, it's not historical, but it really did happen. That's not what he's saying. Nobody's saying that. When they say that something is not historical, they mean it did not actually happen in history. In other words, it's not actually true. They don't say, well, it's true, even though it's not historically accurate. That would make no sense. All right, he goes further. He goes, on top of that, Lisle reflects another common characteristics of many YACists like Ken Ham, when he then calls William Lane Craig's Christian faith into question, accusing him of rejoicing or rejecting foundational Christian truths. All right, let me finish the quote he's fixing. It says, Craig professes to be a Christian, and yet he rejects the foundational truth of Genesis upon which the Christian worldview is based. He's misrepresenting what he actually meant. He's not saying that Craig was not a Christian. In fact, by the way, Dr. Jason Lisle believes, as most young earth creationists, myself included, that this is not a salvation issue. So in spite Joel Anderson trying to make this out to be or that we think it's a salvation issue, most young earth Christians don't think it's a salvation issue. What it is he's misrepresenting what we're actually talking about. What he's saying is that Craig professes Christianity, which assumes certain Christian truths as well as biblical revelation, and yet he rejects the foundational truth of Genesis, meaning that Genesis is a very foundational truth. And there are certain foundational views, such as the fall, which is in Genesis 3, which is a very big deal. Paul makes it a very big deal when he preaches the gospel. So that's what that Lisle is getting at. He's not actually getting at, oh, let's question whether William Lane Craig is a Christian or not. I have heard him multiple times say this is not a salvation issue. He recognizes old earth Christianity, that they're Christians too, and he said this abundantly lots of times. So he's not saying William Lane Craig is not a Christian. That's not what he's saying. He would not argue that, at least not on the basis of this alone. I mean, it would have to take something like a fundamental misunderstanding of the gospel to convince him of that. But just simply, oh, well, he has old earth positions or what he thinks personally about Genesis 1 through 11, and then he must not be a Christian. No, Dr. Lisle does not agree with that, does not believe that. And I could say that confidently. So this is another straw man argument. Dr. Jason Lisle said there were many of them. He constantly straw manned them on. Okay, so from this point on in his post, Lisle follows the format he's been using throughout the critique of William Lane Craig's book. I'll just follow along, summarize the William Lane Craig quotes, and then commenting on Jason Lisle's reaction. Quotes 1 to 3. In the first 3 of William Lane Craig's statement that Lisle quotes, William Lane Craig says that Genesis 3 attempts to ground natural phenomena in the primordial past and the actions of the serpent, the man, and the woman. And although it explains human misery as a result of sin, it doesn't actually explain the origin of itself. After all, the serpent was already deceitful before the woman and man ate the fruit. In any case, William Lane Craig argues it is quite clear that in terms of genre, Genesis 1 to 11 should be understood as having the characteristics of the myth. It does not. All right. He says Lisle responds by saying William Lane Craig is being inconsistent. On one hand, he claimed Genesis 3 is based on which we are to understand things like sin and death. But on the other hand, he's saying the story involving the talking serpent, the eating of the little piece of fruit, etc., isn't really historical. In Lisle's mind, if something isn't historical, then it's not true. Now, understand something. William Lane Craig actually does argue that they're not historical, and so does Anderson. So he's not, William Lane Craig or Dr. Jason Lisle is not saying anything that's not true of their positions. But again, once again, I don't see how he could argue that something is non-historical but true. No historian would ever argue that. If a historian says that this is not true, like take there's a movement in Judaism. It became very popular during like around Eastern Europe, around the Middle Ages. It was called the Hasidic movement, and it was founded by a guy named Bel Shem Tov, which is actually kind of a nickname. His real name was like Israel ben Elisir, something like that. But Bel Shem Tov, not much was known about his birth narrative, but the people that wrote about him fill the pages full of legends and a lot of embellished material. Now, if a historian is looking at the birth narratives in there, which, by the way, not much is known by his birth, so it's very embellished. And if a historian says that's not historically true or historically accurate, or it's not, it's unhistorical, are they saying, oh, well, it actually is true, but it's not history? How could something, because they're taking it as something that actually happened in history. If something, how could something actually not happen in history, but yet be true? That would be a contradiction and a violation of the law and logic law of non-contradiction. So I don't see how he could argue for its truthfulness while at the same time claiming it's non-historical. To me, that just seems to be a contradiction, and that is inconsistent. He goes further. He says a fictional story can't be based on a basis for truth. Of course, any scholar will tell you that myth is not the same as fiction. Name one. I mean, name a scholar that's an Old Testament scholar, or, I mean, yeah, scholars, I mean, they tend to disagree, and myths, actually, there's lots of controversy around the subject of myth, but a lot of scholars would argue that it is. Now, there might be scholars that don't. I think Craig tries to identify with some folklorists, because they would not equate it to falsehood necessarily. But I just don't know how you could really argue that. But that in itself, though, is a pure authority fallacy. Even if the scholars didn't recognize it, would that mean that it's not? Thinking about this logically, how can it be historically true or historically inaccurate, but yet true? How could it be unhistorical, but yet true? It doesn't make any sense. He goes further, he says, and that William Lane Craig is right when he defines myth as deciding non-historical story that articulates the worldview of a given society regarding how they understood God, the gods, humanity, and natural worlds. Dr. Lisle does think there is one type of definition of myth that will come close to how Craig and Anderson is defining myth, but he thinks that they're equivocating on the word myth. They changed the meaning of the word in the context. And of course, that's if you don't add the word prehistory to it. If you add the word prehistory to it, then it certainly isn't like Genesis 1-11, because it starts with the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Where if you look at the other myths, they start in this other realm before creation started, state of chaos, the creating gods, having battles, and all kinds of other stuff is occurring before creation of everything. This is not true of Genesis 1 or Genesis 1. Genesis 1:1, it starts right at the beginning, and me and Dr. Lisle talk about this as well. Simply put, Lisle is rejecting accepted genre categories. No, he isn't. Ignoring accepted definition of myth, and then restating his provably false assertion. It's not provably false. You haven't even proven it false. So why are you calling it a provably false assertion when you haven't even proven it false? If Genesis isn't literal history, then it explains nothing. It's not that it doesn't explain. If you got references, like let's say you're trying to anchor a reality that exists today, and you try to anchor it into a past event, and you claim that something happened to explain this or cause this. I think Jason Lisle in our interview used an example, says that if I say that the mountains were caused by the gods doing a sand castle building contest, that wouldn't be an explanation for why we have mountains. So the only way you can really give a actual explanation that truly explains why we have mountains is to come up with a real world explanation. That's the object of it. You have to come up with a real world explanation. Now, you could come up with a fictional explanation for a fictional scenario. But if you have a real world situation where you're saying, okay, here's the mountain, we know mountains exist, but here's the explanation for it, and the explanation you're coming up with is false, then it doesn't really explain why we have mountains. You know, if Jesus sits there and uses the way in which God instituted marriage in Genesis 3 between the man and the woman, and he uses that to reestablish how marriage was originally established by God, it wouldn't be an explanation if that never actually happened. That's the whole point that Lisle's making, and I think that Anderson is missing his point entirely. Says, in addition, and this is something I simply didn't get, Lisle says that William Craig is confusing style with substance. And Jason Lisle mentioned this as well. He says, well, he doesn't get it. The object of it is that, okay, style is the form of the writing. It's how the information is being presented. It's the way in which the text is being written. Okay. The form, the word form is key there. It's the form of the words, the way in which the information is being presented. Whereas substance or content has to do with the information that's being presented. So what happens is that sometimes people try to confuse the information that's being presented with the way in which it's presented. So if two different genres could present the same information, but present it in two different ways because it's two different genres. I gave you example in my first part concerning like if you have a romance novel versus a love poem, it's going to have the same information in it, but the way in which it expresses that information could be different. I also said, you know, if you had a biography of Jesse James, or if you have a poem about Jesse James, it's going to have similar elements. We would expect that. But that would not mean that they were the same genre. You look at the way in which it expresses that information, that the form of the words, the form of the writing, and the form of the text that we would be looking at. I can give you another example, actually. This one comes straight from the Bible. Okay, I believe Gospel of John and the Book of Revelation written by the same person. We can argue about it whether you think it's written by the same person or not at some point, but I believe it's written by John the Apostle. The Gospel of John and the Book of Revelation are two different genres. Okay, they're two different genres. Now, both of them convey Jesus as the Lamb of God. Both of them mentioned that. That's information that's common to both books, that Jesus is presented as the Lamb of God. All right. In the Gospel of John, when we see this being presented, John the Baptist sees Jesus for the first time, and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world." That's in the Gospel of John. Now, if you look in the Book of Revelation, no one could release the seven seals. John begins to cry about it. The angel says, "Wait a minute, behold, the Lion of Judah, he can release, he's worthy enough to release the seals." So when John looks, he sees a sacrificed lamb. And he says in the narration, "The lamb slain before the foundation of the world." You can see the way in which he expresses the same information. Both books has the same information. Jesus is the Lamb of God, but they present that information differently. Now, based on his conflating of categories, both Anderson and Craig does this, conflate categories where if you conflate style with substance, simply put, imagine it this way. what if somebody gets a hold of this and assumes, oh, well, the Gospel of John must really be apocalyptic because the book of Revelation, which is apocalyptic, just happens to mention the Lamb of God. They both present that same information, but they present it differently, in a different way, in a different form. They express that information in a different way. That is style. That's what style is. And I don't think Anderson gets that. That's why he can't offer any examples. Because if you actually look at the style of literature, it is very different from Genesis chapters 1 through 11. All right, going further, he says, then Lisle asserts, I believe for the 143rd time in this series, the Genesis 1 through 11 historical narrative, and proceeds to go off on a tangent about how Genesis 1 through 11 is about origins, and that, of course, origin stories are about origins, and if simply being about origins is what characterizes a myth, then Big Bang Theory and Darwinian evolution fits William Lane Craig's definition of myth. All right. Again, he thinks that he's just repeating this without giving any basis for it, but Lisle gives quite a bit of basis. We talked about this in the interview as well. And of course, he misunderstands why he brings up evolution and Big Bang. We're getting that in a second. It says, there's one problem with that. In the quotes Lisle gives, William Lane Craig doesn't say that being about origins is what solely defines myth. Well, that's not what Lisle said either. Lisle isn't saying it's solely, he's saying it solely defines myth, but he does claim that this is about origins. Well, of course about origin. They're an origin story. That's the whole point. That's what Lisle was getting at. He goes further, he says, the only time he even uses the word origin is when he points out quite correctly that Genesis 3 doesn't tell us the origin of evil itself. He actually mentions, in his book, he actually mentions it quite a bit. He thinks that it is about origin. He thinks it's about, or that it's a story about origins itself. But the point that Lisle is making is simply that it is about origins. That if it wasn't an origin story, if it wasn't a story, I mean, he's basically quibbling over semantics. It doesn't make any sense. He goes further, he goes, Lisle ends his comments on these first three quotes by offering what he considers to be key characteristics of myth. It is a story made up of people who did not witness the events of the story, and therefore ancient Near Eastern myths, as well as the Big Bang and Darwinian evolution, all can be characterized as myth. All right. Let's see how he responds to this. He says, I'm sorry, but you can't just make up your own special definition that categorizes a myth, that no context in reality, and use that absurd definition to categorize actual scientific theories that you don't like. First of all, if he didn't make up his definition of myth, he actually goes to the English dictionary and defines myth. And me and him actually talked about this in the interview as well. His definition would go on the English dictionary. I mean, there's lots of disputes among scholars how to define myth, so it's not set in stone. But in any given case, that's usually what we would do. We would go to the dictionary and define it. And there are different ways to define it. But he's not making up his own definition of myth. And by the way, nobody who has ever written a myth literature in history witnessed those events. And no historian would ever argue that someone writing like the Enuma Elish witnessed those events. So I don't know if he really thinks that they were witnessed or what. Just so you can dismiss them out of hand, he didn't just dismiss them out of hand. He actually dealt with the arguments. I'm sorry, but I don't know of one biblical scholar or literature scholar who defines the genre of myth that way. I don't know. Okay, outside of the obvious pill authority policy, English literature. If he said literature scholar, the only literature scholar I know of that would be dealing with this kind of stuff is a classicist. But usually people say classicist when they're talking about classicist. He may be talking about an English literature scholar, because the English literature scholar deals with English literature, but not with ancient Near Eastern literature or any kind of classical work. So I don't know, what scholars he's dealing with, but any given case, scholars actually dispute what they think about myth. It's heavily disputed. I've got a book. Um, I got a book here, the Bible Among the Myths by John Oswalt, and he talks about these disputes among scholars who dispute what a myth is, and it can be defined a number of ways. I think he splits it up into like certain major categories: etymological definition, phenomenological definition. Personally, I think Anderson and Craig is using what Oswald calls a phenomenological definition of myth. But there's lots of different ways in which scholars have defined it. So you can't really just point to scholars and say, well, no, scholars differ greatly on how they would define myth. Given that reality, I must pose this challenge to everyone who reads Lisle. Okay, listen to this. He puts it in bold just to make it look important. Who do you think has more knowledge and scholarly expertise when it comes to proper definition and literary characteristics of ancient Near Eastern myth? Actual biblical and literature scholars who don't agree on what the definition of myth is. In fact, Oswald, he's an Old Testament scholar, and he has a different definition of myth. I think Oswald said he takes the he takes the centrality of continuity, what he calls the centrality of continuity definition of myth. So, yeah, if you were going by what scholars define myth, then you'll be all over the place in terms of their definition. All right. Again, this appears to be a appeal authority fallacy, but listen, actual biblical and literature scholar or a YSCS astrophysicist who has absolutely no education or expertise in biblical studies or ancient literature. By the way, Dr. Jason Lisle told me in an interview that in college, he had to sit there and read, I think he said it was 100 ancient myth stories, including ancient Near Eastern, and he could not find. He thought that it would be similarities between them, between Genesis 1 to 11. He expected that, but then when he looked at it, he saw that they were significantly different in terms of literary style. With that said, Dr. Jason Lisle wrote a book called Understanding Genesis, which he actually goes over these different various literatures in the Bible, as well as how to properly interpret them. So he has a lot of significant research, and Jason Lisle is very intelligent. And like I said, talking with him, I'm even more convinced of that. But he's a very smart guy, and even though he was obviously called to the scientific field, I think he would make a great scholar as well. He's certainly got the mind for it. So I don't think this does him justice, and it certainly doesn't really impugn his arguments any. It doesn't really affect that any. It doesn't, like Dr. Jason Lisle said in his concluding statement on my channel, that he thinks his argument went unrefuted, has gone unrefuted so far, unless Anderson can provide an actual example or evidence where the styles are the same. And so far, he has not been able to produce that, not even this time. He says, it goes further, he goes, and who has argued, this one, that there can be no time zones or can be time zones throughout the universe, and that explains why we can measure light from millions of light years away. That's not Jason Lisle's argument. He misunderstood something he said in there concerning that, and he assumed that that's what he believes. But his position is actually what's called the anisotropic, what he calls the anisotropic synchrony convention. He's actually written in peer-reviewed literature on that, by the way. But you notice the ad hominem fallacy here. what Jason Lisle thinks or believes, even though he kind of strawmanned him there, what he thinks or believes on one thing has no relevance this time around. You know, you can't argue that just because you don't agree with me on this point over here that has nothing to do with Genesis 1 to 11. That must mean you should not take me seriously when I'm talking about Genesis 1 to 11. That's not the way this works. That's actually an ad hominem fallacy. Okay, quotes number 4 through 8, he says. All right, in the next group of quotes that Lisle gives from William Lane Craig's book, William Lane Craig wrestles with the apparent interest in history that he feels can be found in Genesis 1 to 11. Most notably, he mentions the genealogies in Genesis 1 through 11 and how they eventually connect up to Abraham, who is clearly portrayed as a real person in history. That being said, William Lane Craig acknowledges that mere chronology in a story doesn't automatically mean that given story is actually history. Like I said, this is what William Lane Craig is wrestling with in the quotes when Lisle provides. He's trying to figure out how Genesis 1 to 11 seems to be myth in one sense, but history in another. It doesn't seem to be myth in any sense. The literary style is very different. On the one hand, I understand why William Lane Craig and many people see the genealogies in Genesis 1 to 11 and immediately think, oh, it must be historical. But I think that assumption would be wrong. No, it wouldn't. You don't see that kind of style. If you look at myth literature, you don't see genealogies. And it's not just the fact that genealogies are referenced, it's the kinds of information that are present in the genealogy. For example, how old the patriarch was when they were born, when when other people were born, when they died. These kinds of things are indicative of historical narrative, but they're not so in myth literature. I poured through these. You don't see these kinds of details at all. The way in which the historical narrative weaves attention to detail is very different from what we see in myth literature. Says when it comes to the genealogies in Genesis 1 to 11, my view is that they aren't trying to give an actual historical genealogy. Yes, they are. They are serving a literary function to highlight the divide between the woman's offspring and the serpent's offspring. He has a weird view of this. I talked about it in my debate review when he sat there and mentioned it. I also mentioned it and talked about it in my last part where I had my interview with Dr. Jason Lisle. Simply put, first off, they don't highlight the good from the bad and that sort of thing. I think he has some faulty interpretation along those lines. And really, if that was their, like Dr. Jason Lisle said, if that was their purpose, if that was what they're trying to accomplish, then they would never give the kinds of details that they would have given. It would be pointless to keep on, to mention the ages of the patriarchs when someone was born or, when they died. None of that would have been pointless, would have been completely pointless. Plus, if you look at the actual context, the purpose of Genesis to highlight that all of them was bad, and that as sin multiplied upon the earth, it became even worse and worse and worse until it got to the time of Noah's flood. And so, and the Bible says that their hearts were evil continually. So there's lots of issues involving his interpretation of that, and I would greatly disagree with. But the more I think about it, though, the more I'm convinced that even if they had some kind of agenda or some other reason to imply, that wouldn't change the literary genre. Because if we look at like Matthew's gospel, he includes a genealogy of Jesus. He puts 3 sets of 14 in order to indicate that Jesus was from the line of David. It's the practice of what's called gematria, which is basically counting letters in the Hebrew alphabet and then adding the numbers together. If you look at David's name, it's David or Dawid, however you want to pronounce the Bible. But Dawid or uh, David is three consonants. It's the Dalet, Vav, and Dalet. And the Dalet has the fourth character of the alphabet, while the Vav is the sixth. So you got 4, 6, 4. And I'm going this way because Hebrew reads backwards. So this is actually the front of the line. This would be the last of the line. So you got 4, 6, 4, and you add those together, it's 14. So he's doing this to show that Jesus is from the line of David, from the lineage of David. Does that change the literary style? No. Does that mean that the genealogy isn't added because it wasn't historical narrative? No. It doesn't really impact anything. It doesn't make it unhistorical. It doesn't make it non-literal. It doesn't do any of those things. Having an agenda why you would insert a genealogy doesn't change the literary genre itself. It will still be that only historical narrative had these kinds of details in it. You wouldn't expect that from poetic narrative. You wouldn't expect that from myth literature. And if you actually read these things, they don't have any of this kind of stuff in there. So he says he appreciates William Lane Craig's honestly wrestling with this issue. He'll appreciate anything that he thinks supports his position. But in reality, I mean, it's really not an honest wrestling for William Lane Craig because he already had presupposed his viewpoint ahead of time. And it was not too much of a leap for him to sit there and jump into that extreme position. But no, that's not, but the evidence shows that it's clearly historical narrative. All right. He goes further, he says, so how does Lisle react to William Lane Craig admitting that seeing genealogies in Genesis 1-11 and how they are linked to Abraham seem to suggest they are really historical in some way? You think Lisle would voice his agreement? Well, not so much. Lisle clearly cannot process nuance and ambiguity. William Lane Craig is trying to wrestle with how Genesis 1-11 has a lot of characteristics that continues to myth. No, it doesn't. Again, he's confusing content with genre. But no, the style is not the same. I showed you what the style looks like. I've got an additional one on this computer I don't have on this one. But I sit there and look through them, and the style is very, very different. I do not see no similarity in style. And William Lane Craig never showed any evidence that the style itself, the way in which it's being described, is the same as Genesis 1-11, or Genesis 1-11, same as these myth literatures. He's never been able to show that. In fact, he actually admits to their differences. That's why he thinks it's a unique genre, which he calls mytho-history in the first place, because he admits that. All right. He says, but B, how the genealogies seem to suggest real history, because they do suggest real history, because they are real history. And he's trying to make sense of it all. In other words, William Lane Craig is trying to mesh the idea that these are myth literature when there's no evidence that they are, and then try to combine that with the fact that they have all the earmarks of historical narrative. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out if they have all the earmarks of historical narrative. If they have all the similarities in style to historical narrative, that it must be historical narrative. So far, Anderson has not produced a single shred of evidence. He wants to point to William Lane Craig believing that these have similar characteristics, but the characteristics are extremely broad that he uses, and the criteria that he uses can be applied to pretty much a number of genres and literatures. And the information is you can't sit there and conflate the information that's being presented with how the information is being presented. You can't do that. That's a categorical error. All right. and he's trying to make sense of it all. No, he's not. Lisle doesn't seem to need to even try to do that. That's because he knows it's historical narrative. That's the problem. You don't seem to understand that. The evidence shows that it's historical narrative. If all of the evidence shows it's historical narrative, then why should I believe it's something else besides historical narrative if the evidence supports this historical narrative? And he says for the 236th time, I think he's just making up these numbers, and simply asserts Genesis 1 through 11 is literal history. That's because that's what it is. And by the way, Lisle constantly, Dr. Lisle constantly, and me and Dr. Lisle even talked about this, presented evidence, basis for why he thinks it's historical narrative. So far, Joe Edmund Anderson, I've read up to 3 posts so far, and he has not presented a shred of evidence. Maybe we can look at his book critique and see if he offers any evidence. But I read probably maybe the first 3 or maybe 2.5, I can't remember, of his post regarding his critique of William McCrary's book. And even then, he doesn't offer any evidence of what I've read so far. So the interesting thing is he's not offering any basis. He just simply asserts it's not historical narrative and has the similarity in style as myth literature. That's all he does. He doesn't provide no examples. He provides no evidence. He just asserts it. The very thing in which he accuses Dr. Lisle of. These are generalities with the patriarchs in Genesis 12 50 and Genesis 1 through 11 is written in the exact same way. He said, yeah, they're written in the exact same style. Absolutely. Without a hint of difference. And he says, end of story. I mean, it's not the end of story. I mean, there's plenty more, but the evidence shows that it's historical narrative. Historical narrative gives details and fiction doesn't. It's not just the fact that it gives details. Myth can give details. It's the kinds of information that it gives. For example, when it does the genealogies, it tells how old the patriarch was when, the other one or the next person in line was born, how old they were when they died. These kinds of attention to detail you don't see in myth literature. I have no idea how old Gilgamesh was because it doesn't tell us. I have no idea when he died. I don't think he did die at least in the narrative. I think maybe he gained immortality. I can't remember. Some of the characters and heroes in some of the myth literatures gain immortality. But there's no this kind of information is not present in there. The series of Bob consecutives are not present, which is indicative of historical narrative, not present in myth literature, but it is present in Hebrew historical narrative. He says historical narrative of details and fiction doesn't. That was not exactly, he's missing the point. Genesis 1 through 11 is historical narrative. Yes, absolutely, it is. And this is based on the evidence, not just me saying it. Okay, now here he gives kind of a very, I don't know, it's a weird analogy. He tries to go through a South Park episode. That show is about as immoral as anything I've ever seen. And the fact that he's giving that as an example, it shows the kind of mentality. It's not a very, I think Dr. Lisle is completely right. This is not a scholarly treatise. This is somebody who has an emotional knee-jerk reaction to him presenting the article, but he hasn't done anything to refute his arguments at all. So it's just a weird thing. Okay, quote number 9. The final quote Lisle gives from William Craig. William Craig refers to the artificial symmetry of the 10 antediluvian ancestors from Adam through Noah, that is then followed by 10 post-diluvian ancestors from Shem through Abraham. That, along with the admittedly fantastic lifespans, what makes it fantastic, I wonder? We'll get into that, because what makes it fantastic is the fact that people don't normally live that long today. It's not fantastic. It's just you're assuming your position ahead of time. It's only fantastic because people don't live that way today, but that don't mean people didn't at one point. Of the antediluvians indicates to William Lane Craig that we are not dealing with simple, straightforward history. Yes, we are. Just because he argues in a circle with the lifespans doesn't mean you're not dealing with straightforward history. All right. He said, William Lane Craig is correct on that. No, he isn't. No, he isn't. Absolutely not. Give me some examples. Show me some evidence that William Lane Craig is correct on that. And so starting it. And he goes further, he goes, again, I applaud him for taking into serious consideration all the things he brings up in his book. Again, the thing that Dr. Lisle is responding to isn't Craig's book, it's his First Things article. He confuses this and thinks he's bringing it up from his book. Interesting enough, in his 4-part critique of Craig's book, he shows actually a disinterest. He has some things that he likes about it, but then by the time he reached the end of it, he didn't appreciate it, didn't like it very much. So his view on that might have even changed, because I don't know why he just, for some reason, he got in this thing where he thinks Lisle was responding to Craig's book, and he keeps on asserting that. I don't know if he ever found the truth out. Hopefully he's reading this and he knows that Lisle wasn't responding to Craig's book. He was responding to Craig's article in First Things. And he says so himself as well in the interview that I had with him. He also said that I said that in the first part of this response to Joel Edmund Anderson. All right. He says he's not just dismissing everything in Genesis 1 through 11 that indicates that it is in genre of myth. There's nothing that indicates it's genre of myth. Name something. Give me some examples. Give me some examples so we can evaluate it. Something from the style. Okay, let me explain how a literary evaluation goes, because I don't know if Anderson understands how a literary evaluation goes in the first place. Essentially, a literary evaluation is an internal critique of the genre. And then you do other internal critiques of other genres, and then you contrast them, especially with known genres that we already know what the genre is. So we know if that is, it has all the earmarks of that particular type of genre. Okay, when we do an internal critique of Genesis 1 through 11, and then we contrast that to historical narrative, it has all the earmarks of historical narrative. Nothing in myth literature. Myth literatures are written in poetic narrative. Myth literature has things in it such as like the way in which it describes creation is very different from it's not just enough to say, oh, both of these are creation accounts. The way in which it describes creation is very different. You know, in myth literature, they're creating from chaos, and there's usually a chaos monster involved. You don't see that in Genesis 1 at all. They're always taking place in another realm where they're creating other types of events happening, you know, a battle or like the state of chaos exists, or the creation of other gods, things like that, things that are happening before the beginning. But in Genesis count, it starts with the beginning, and me and Dr. Lisle talked about that as well. So the literary evaluation of the style of literature clearly indicates that Genesis 1 through 11 is that of historical narrative, not myth literature. There's nothing in the style. I mean, these texts are written in poetic narrative. Genesis 1 to 11 is not poetic narrative. Even Craig admits that in his book, that Genesis 1 to 11 is not poetic narrative. And they're just like, they're fundamentally different. The kinds of information that's included there. If you look at the way in which they use conjunctions, it's never in the same way that like in Hebrew historical narrative, where you see them using vowel consecutives. The way in which the kinds of attention of detail, like with the dimensions of Noah's Ark, or or more specifically like the how old somebody was when they were born. You know, the use of irrelevant details, things that you wouldn't see in myth literature, things that would bog down a fictional story. The smooth transition from chapters 11 to 12 and chapters 12 to 50 is often recognized as historical narrative. You see the use of genealogies, like in Genesis 5 and 11. You can contrast this to Genesis 25. The kinds of information are definitely there. And First Chronicles 1 and others. And Matthew and Luke has genealogies in it as well. This kind of writing is history. And you got the Toledos, which indicates that Moses used sources of information. This is not common among myth literature. And like I said, me and Dr. Jason Lisle talked about all of this. This has all the earmarks of that's indicative of historical narrative. None involving myth. I read these. The style of literature is very different. And again, I would challenge Joe Edmund Anderson, produce a single example, a shred of evidence, just one, from the style of Genesis 1 through 11, which is the same thing as the style of these myth literatures. Don't just say, oh, well, they both have creation accounts. That's not the style. That's the information, because the way in which they describe creation is very different. So I would challenge you on this. Joe Edmund Anderson, if you're watching this, produce a shred of evidence for your position. So far, you haven't done it. And I don't think you will, be honest. And pretty much, he says, and pretty much everything in Genesis 1 to 11 indicates that. No. If he thinks everything in Genesis 1 to 11, give me some examples. You think Genesis 1 indicates it? How? Think Genesis 2 indicates it? How? Think Genesis 3 indicates it? How? And we can go all the way to Genesis 11. How does it indicate myth? Give me some examples from the style. He gives the impression that he is honestly trying to understand and interpret Genesis properly. I think he's talking about William Lane Craig. No, he doesn't give you that impression. He gives you the impression. I read Bill Craig's book. He gives me the impression of somebody with an agenda before he ever began his investigation to offset the historicity of Adam and Eve as far as the historical foundations of them. So that way he can be able to be open up to a new narrative involving Adam and Eve that is contrary to what scripture says. And so the feeling I get is not a scholarly book, because it doesn't, if you read Craig's book, most of the sources that he appeals to are secular. The vast majority of them. Even among old earth creationists, he only uses a certain amount of sources. He uses very few sources, which is kind of strange because he's an old earth creationist. Most of his sources are secular sources, meaning sources outside of Christian community. Outside the Christian community. I'm not saying you can't use sources like that, but if you're going to make a scholarly treatise, you need to be able to deal and interact with other arguments. Stephen Boyd is never even, he's a Hebrew scholar and one of the biggest voices among young earth creationists, and the one who seems to be cited the most by young earth creationists. And as far as presenting his position on it being historical narrative, and he was on the Rate Project. His material is appeared in peer review book, namely Volume 2 of Radioized and the Age of the Earth. And you think he would have been cited by Craig. He's not even mentioned, not even referenced once. Very few young Earth creationist sources are even referenced. I think 4. I think it's I heard of count of, and I've checked it out to see. And two of them were Old Testament, leading Old Testament scholars, and 2 was leading young Earth creationist scientists. And those are the only 4 he cites. But he never once cites Stephen Boyd, who's one of the biggest voices among young Earth Christians. You don't get the feeling that this is a very scholarly treatise, whether instead you get the feeling that Craig has an agenda and he's pushing that agenda on it. He wants to open the door to evolution. He wants to believe that you know that he can open up to whatever narrative he wants to believe about Adam and Eve without being tied down, restricted by what the scripture says concerning this couple. All right, so you don't get the feeling that he's honestly wrestling with it. You get the feeling of someone who has an agenda. That's what you get. He says further, he says, well, not surprisingly, Lisle doesn't see it that way. First, he takes the issue with how William Lane Craig characterizes the post-Diluvian Diluvian ancestors. Anyone who is literally competent, you see the question begging epithet fallacy there. He's using a loaded term here, competent. He's suggesting that Lisle isn't competent because he doesn't agree with him. Trust me, Lisle's very competent. I promise you, he's probably written much more books than Anderson has written. He is a PhD scientist, and he's professional at it. He has a PhD in astronomy and physics. He double majored in astronomy and physics, so he's an astronomer and astrophysics physicist, and he's also a mathematician. He minored in mathematics, so he's very competent. Trying to assume he's incompetent just because he doesn't agree with you, it's fallacious reasoning. We'll get what William Lane Craig is saying. You have 10 antediluvian from Adam to Noah, then the flood, then 10 post-diluvian from Shem to Abraham. First of all, they don't know what actually counts as an antediluvian. Antediluvian literally means before the flood. That's what it means. Those who were born before the flood. Technically speaking, Shem would be antediluvian, like what Dr. Jason Lisle said in this post. And it wouldn't be symmetrical. Well, I'll get into that because he's about to cover that in a minute. Well, Lisle, in the manner of a true wooden literalist. I don't understand what the term wooden literalist. Okay, I understand why y'all call us literalists. It's a straw man fallacy. You assume that we believe that everything in the Bible is literal in the sense that it is non-figurative, and we don't accept figurative language in the Bible, which is a straw man argument. So this is based on a straw man argument. But how would you define a literalist, and how would you define a wooden literalist? What would be the difference in the way in which you're expressing both terms? It doesn't make any sense. I assume he's accusing Lisle as a wooden literalist because Lisle doesn't want to believe that it's myth literature when clearly all the evidence suggests that it isn't myth literature, and the evidence is on the side of it being historical narrative. But he wants Lisle to go ahead and just, I don't know, academically be peer pressured into accepting his view, or he's just not being open-minded. I've heard this kind of argument before. You're just not being open-minded unless you accept what I think. Why don't you accept what I think? Are you a wooden literalist if you don't accept what I think? So yeah, I don't understand that term. It's an odd term, really, because how would you tell the difference between a literalist and a wooden literalist since you're using both of them in the same manner? All right, but anyway, he's only calling him that because he disagrees with him. Says, no, Shem was actually born before the flood, which is true, he was. So he counts as an antediluvian, and he does, and that makes it 11 to 9. Now understand something, Lisle makes it clear in the context. when Dr. Lisle said that, he said that he was not counting Abraham. Now, normally I just count Abraham. So I say 11 to 10 because I'm counting Abraham. But he does say in the thing, not including Abraham. And he says 11, he does say 11 to 9, which is true if you don't include Abraham. That's absolutely right. In which case he wasn't, because he said he wasn't including Abraham. I usually include Abraham, so I usually just say 11 to 10. And that's not asymmetrical, which, no, he's saying it's not symmetrical. He said, I don't know, I think he got his terms confused here for a second. William and Craig is arguing for symmetry, and Lisle is saying, no, it's not symmetric. So he's not saying that it is symmetrical, or it is not. He's not saying that it's. He's saying that it's asymmetrical, and he says that's not asymmetrical. Well, that's the point. It's not symmetrical, not asymmetrical. It's not symmetrical. But even if it was, and he does give that argument, even if it was, it wouldn't necessarily make, and he's fixing to get into this, it would not necessarily make something not historical to begin with. All right. And of course, he doesn't really give a counter argument. You'll see that in a minute. He just kind of brushes it aside. But Lisle is correct. The way in which antediluvian versus post-diluvian patriarchs are numbered, it would be 11 to 9, not including Abraham. Like I said, I usually include Abraham, and so it becomes 11 to 10. But if you don't include Abraham, it's 11 to 9. It's absolutely correct. And he goes, and Anderson goes further. He says, he then says, even if they are symmetrical, and they're not symmetrical. How is that symmetrical? If, in fact, by the way, in either one of these, he gives no actual counter argument. I don't know. I just want to kind of point that out to everybody when they look at that. He doesn't give a counter argument. Here, he just simply quotes Lisle or reference what Lisle says, basically. I mean, he summarizes them, but he puts them in a quotation. And he doesn't give any counter argument. He doesn't say, hey, that's not true, other than to say, well, he's just arguing that, and then the flood, and then, you know, these people that lived afterwards. But even if you counted their death, it still wouldn't be symmetrical, because it would be 9 to 11 if you don't include Abraham. Now, I usually include Abraham, so because Abraham is mentioned in the lineage there. So if you include Abraham, it's 10 to 11. But if you don't include Abraham, it's like 11 to 9. So it's not very symmetrical. In spite of the fact that both Craig and Anderson are arguing that it is, it's not. But even if it was, and we'll get into that, he goes further, summarizing, trying to summarize. Like I said, he strawmans Dr. Lisle's position a lot. But he goes further with the summary. That still doesn't prove they're not historical. They're not historical narrative. After all, in 1835, Mark Twain was born and Halley Comet was seen. And then in 1910, Mark Twain died and Halley Comet was seen again. And nobody suggests that Mark Twain was a fictional character, which is true. No one did. No one says that Mark Twain was fictional, that that the events surrounding him is false, that Halley Comet never really visited our solar system. No one says that, because the fact that something is symmetrical does not have nothing to do with whether or not it doesn't have nothing to do with it being historically true to begin with. And second, it has nothing to do with whether it's historical narrative. It has nothing to do with the style of literature. Now, you think, okay, he presents this, has no counter argument, presents this, has no counter argument. You think he would have produced a counter argument. This is what he says instead. I'm not kidding. That really was his argument. Then he moves on to the lifespans. What? All he did was basically brush aside the argument. Says, I don't agree with that. That's his argument. I don't agree with it. let's move on. He gave no counter argument, none. You think he would have given a counter argument? He doesn't give a counter argument. Simply saying that's his argument, I'm not kidding, and then moving on. That's not an argument. That's not an argument at all. He just kind of brushed it, Dr. Lisle aside. Okay, now he moves on to the fantastic lifespans. You know, the word fantastic here is a little bit loaded, but listen to what he says. He says, as for the fantastic lifespans, Lisle's reaction by wondering why William Lane Craig would think that living 900 years isn't possible. After all, the New Testament teaches that we will be resurrected and live forever. If William Lane Craig believes that, then why can't he believe Genesis 1:11 is historical, despite all its mythological characteristics? Okay, if you're still manning a position, why would you add that in there when Lisle doesn't take that position? His position is that it doesn't have the same characteristics as the styles of myth literature. And if you're going to argue that, show some examples, show some evidence. He failed to present any evidence at all. So they don't have characteristics with myth. I showed you that. I've seen these ancient Near Eastern literatures. They don't have the same characteristics as Genesis 1-11. More specifically, the style of literature is not the same. These texts are written in poetic narrative. Genesis 1-11 is not poetic narrative. Even Craig admits that in his book. And he says, and that people before a global flood, for which there's no solid evidence for, this guy really needs to start reading up on scientists that have defended the global flood. There's quite a bit of evidence for the global flood, not just biblical references. That's, in my opinion, that'll be the strongest evidence because it's a strong historical source regarding a historical event. But in an indirect sense, we also have some scientific evidence for a global flood as well, geologically. And so, you know, like most fossils are found on marine fossils. Over 70% of them are marine fossils. The bulk of them are mollusks. And mollusk shells are found, mollusk shells are made out of calcium carbonate connected by a network of organic tissue. These usually degrade within a couple hours after their death. So the shell falls apart. On top of that, right after death, they're like in case clams and oysters, they open up. So we should not find these fossilized, but we find these fossilized all over the world together, closed, which is strong evidence for rapid burial. We also find jellyfish in the fossil record. They're soft-bodied creatures. These would degrade quickly and would resist being fossilized, especially by a slow, gradual process, because there's no way that they could be fossilized. But we find these in the fossil record. And of course, we got like 300, about average between 200 to 500. I don't know exactly how many. I think there's definitely over 200 that are cataloged, possibly 300 that are now cataloged. 300 is usually the number that's given. So I usually say about over 300 flood legends all over the world. And they're found in every culture around the world, in every major culture. They're found flood legends. And this strong historical support for the global flood itself. You know, and we could point to a lot of stuff. We could point to all the erosions in the world that even if you grant the 4.5 billion years you think the Earth has been around, there's been enough time for all that much erosion to occur. You got escarpments and planation surfaces and things like that. Lots of geological features that would indicate that something major happened to physically warp the landscape as we now see it. So there's lots of evidence for the global flood. So him thinking that there is no global flood shows that he's not aware of the models that have been created by young Earth creation scientists. He's not aware of what's been written on the subject matter, claiming that there's no evidence for it, no solid evidence for it. Okay, where in the world is he getting this? Could have lived for 900 years. What Lisle doesn't get is that it isn't a matter of God couldn't have done it that way, as it has extremely long lifespans, are again a characteristic of ancient Near Eastern writing by pre-middle times, i.e. the mythological realm. Okay. Unless the person or God in question is immortal, the myth literature does not record specific ages of patriarchs or characters within the narrative like that. You don't get that. You don't get long lifespans like that. The closest thing we get to it in terms of ancient Near East is the Babylonian Kings list, which you have long lifespans there. And even then, it doesn't really say specifically that they live long. You assume it. We can infer it from the text, from the inscriptions, because of the long reigns of the kings. But it doesn't give the specific ages and stuff of each king. We just assume it because they reigned for thousands of years in some cases in the Babylonian kings list. But as far as ancient Near Eastern literature, meaning the documents, sources themselves, the documentary sources themselves, no, we don't have what we have in Genesis 5 and 11 at all. So if you're going to say that this is indicative of myth literature, show me the evidence. Show me some examples of that. The closest you're going to ever come is the King's List, and it's not really classified as an ancient Near Eastern literature. It's an inscription on a tablet. Okay, and even then, it doesn't give any of their ages. It just simply talks about the reigns of each king, and these reigns are very long, so we can infer from that a long lifespan. But it doesn't specifically give us ages and stuff. All right. So he goes further. He's ending his post here. This is the last bit he writes on there on Lisle's critique. He says, long story short, Wimley Craig seems at least to seriously wrestle with how to understand Genesis 1 through 11. No, he doesn't. While Lisle simply does little more than stamp his feet and scream, no, there will be no more smoking. That's a reference to the South Park example he gave earlier that was, in my opinion, childish, you know. But in any given case, that's not what Lisle did. Dr. Lisle gave evidence for his historical narrative. So far, we've gone through 3 posts of Joel Edmund Anderson critique of Lisle, all 3 of them, the only ones he has up on his blog site, and he says he's not going to make any more. And he has not produced a single blog where he's presented evidence, actual evidence from the literary styles of these genres that they're the same genre. He's not produced it yet, and I doubt he will. Yeah, well, that's it for right now. I'm gonna now cue the closing arguments here. Well, that's it for the Genesis controversy. I appreciate you watching, and this has been fun. I did the first 3 parts of Anderson's critique. I am going to continue with the responding to Joel Anderson, though, not just in other forums, but I'm also going to continue the series with the 4-part review that Anderson does of Craig's book, because he makes a series of arguments in there that I want to respond to. Not because I'm really interested in his opinion about Craig's book. I don't care about that. The issue really is some of the arguments that he does make in there. And so I want to counter that and respond to those. And so we'll continue it in part 4 of this series and all the way up until I conclude, because Anderson didn't finish off his critique of Lisle, because he ends it at 3 parts. And then he supplements it with a 4-part book review of Craig's book. So we're going to continue responding to him in those 4 parts so that we can end this properly. And we're going to do that. And there's a series of arguments he does make in there that I do want to deal with, including the fact that he strawmans our positions as well. And so I want to deal with that. But I agree with Lisle's conclusion on this, Dr. Lisle's conclusion on this, that Anderson provided no evidence for it. His response appears to be more emotional, more knee-jerk reaction type deal, not very scholarly at all. I don't get the impression that this is a scholarly critique. It's more of someone responding who has a particular agenda in mind, and there's no thoughtful intellectual discussion of the issues. He keeps asserting that it's not historical narrative, that it's of the genre of myth, but he provides no examples, provides no evidence, gives no reasons at all for thinking that that's the case. In my interview with Dr. Jason Lisle, we covered the genealogies, the toledotes, the evolved consecutives in Genesis 1. We showed that that's how the features of historical narratives, such as Numbers 7 has a series of evolved consecutives. We see that. We see that current also in the genealogies, the kinds of information that are presented in Genesis 5:11, the same kinds of information presented in Genesis 25, 1 Chronicles 1. We see, in Matthew and Luke, we see a list of genealogies as well. These are indicative of historical narrative. You don't see the kinds of things that would be indicative of a poetic narrative, which is what these ancient Near Eastern literature is written in. And so the style of literature is very, very different. It is not the same. And Anderson gave no evidence at all to the contrary of that. He just kind of did this hand waving thing where he just kind of waved the arguments away. He didn't agree with it, and that was it, and then he moved on. That's not the way you handle arguments. You produce a counter argument. You say it's wrong. You tell me why you think it's wrong. You show me reasons. You justify it with evidence. You justify it with good reasoning. And he didn't do that. In fact, he strawmanned Dr. Lisle numerous times, as Dr. Lisle himself pointed out. And as I pointed out, he strawmanned him a number of times, as well as young earth creationists in general. So it's just usual of the kinds of things that we expect from Joel Edmund Anderson. But we'll see when he does his critique of Lisle's book, because he'll try to take that a little bit more seriously than he did with Lisle's or Dr. Lisle's position. But we'll see whether or not if he gives any evidence or any examples when we deal with this 4-part critique of William Lane Craig's book, and we'll see the kinds of arguments that he presents. In the meantime, everyone stay in the know, and this is your resident Christian apologist, Brian Keith Bowen, signing off.